Welcome, special soul. Tonight we will be falling asleep to how medieval peasants survived plagues, famine and lords. Before we begin, I just wanted to say thank you for joining, and I hope your thoughts start to slow and you start to rest. Also, comment down below what time it is where you live, and as always, please subscribe only if you like these calming videos that take it back to history that should never be forgotten. Imagine, if you will, a small medieval village. The year is somewhere around the 1300s. The air is crisp, the fields stretch wide, and a cluster of thatched huts rises from the earth, their smoky chimneys sending wisps of grey into the morning sky. Chickens scratch at the ground, dogs bark lazily, and the distant toll of a church bell calls peasants to prayer, to work, and to the rhythm of life that has continued for centuries. This is the world of the medieval peasant, a life of hardship, yes, but also one of endurance, of family bonds, and of quiet moments by the hearth. As the sun sets and the cold creeps in, the flicker of firelight glows against stone walls, and the stories of survival whisper across generations. In this journey tonight, we will step into their shoes. We will walk the muddy roads, bend over the plough, kneel in prayer within wooden chapels, and feel the weight of plague and famine as it bore down upon entire communities. But through it all, we will also see the resilience, the rituals, and the small joys that kept peasants alive under the watchful eye of their lords. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let the quiet rhythm of history guide you gently towards sleep as we explore how medieval peasants survived plagues, famine, and the rule of their lords. Now let's start by talking about the daily life of peasants. The peasant's day began early, often before the first light of dawn. A rooster's crow was the alarm clock, and the crackle of the hearth fire signalled the start of another day of labour. Peasants lived in small one-room huts made of wattle and daub, wooden frames filled with mud and straw. The floors were dirt, often shared with chickens, goats, or a family pig. Smoke from the hearth curled upward, sometimes escaping through a hole in the roof, sometimes lingering in the room, coating the walls with soot. Beds were straw-stuffed sacks, shared by the entire family for warmth. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, made from coarse rye or barley, was the staple. A thin vegetable stew, flavoured with onions, cabbage or leeks, simmered in blackened iron pots. Meat was rare, often reserved for festivals or for those peasants who could hunt small game in the forests, though this was risky, as many woods were reserved for lords and nobles. Children helped from an early age. Girls carried water from the well, tended gardens and spun wool. Boys herded animals, fetched firewood, and learned to guide the plough. Adults worked the fields endlessly, sowing and reaping, often labouring not just for themselves but for their lords, who demanded taxes in crops, labour or coin. And yet, despite the hardship, there were small comforts. The warmth of a shared meal, the sound of a lute played during feast days, the laughter of children chasing one another through the muddy lanes. For the medieval peasant, life was difficult, but it was not without its rhythms of hope and endurance. Now let's dive into the shadow of plague's illness was a constant shadow in the life of medieval peasants. In a world without modern medicine, even the smallest sickness could spread rapidly and prove deadly. A simple cough might linger and become something far worse. A wound from farm work, if left untreated, could fester, and beyond these everyday ailments, waves of devastating disease swept across Europe, leaving fear and sorrow in their wake. The most infamous of all was the bubonic plague, remembered as the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, carried, many historians believe, by fleas on rats that travelled aboard merchant ships. For peasants who had already lived close to hunger and hardship, the plague was like a storm that darkened the skies of daily life. Imagine the village scene, a small hamlet of thatched huts, the fields stretching out beyond. A child develops a fever, their skin hot to the touch. Within days, swollen lumps, called buboes, appear under the arms and at the neck. Panic spreads, for everyone knows what this means. Soon the sickness moves from hut to hut, sparing few. The priest tolls the church bell, not once, but again and again, as villagers fall ill. Graves are dug hastily, sometimes in mass pits, because there are too many dead to bury in the old way. It was not just the Black Death that haunted peasants, however. Other illnesses lurked in the background. Smallpox, measles, and typhoid fever could break out at any time. Winters were especially cruel, when weakened bodies were more vulnerable to infection. With poor sanitation, open waste, and animals often kept inside the same room as people for warmth, disease found fertile ground to thrive. Peasants relied on remedies passed down through generations. A mixture of herbs steeped in ale, garlic crushed into paste, or charms hung above doorways were believed to keep sickness away. The church played a central role too. When plague struck, priests led processions through the village, chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, and urging confession, for many believed that illness was a punishment for sin. And yet, in the quiet resilience of these people, survival persisted. Some families fled to the countryside, hoping that isolation might protect them. Others tended to the sick as best they could, even knowing the risks. Communities learned to endure wave after wave of illness, and in that endurance lay the strength that carried medieval peasants through centuries of hardship. The plague reshaped everything. In its wake, entire villages were abandoned, fields lay empty, and lords struggled to find enough workers to farm their lands. For peasants who survived, the world shifted. Labour became more valuable, wages rose, and the rigid structures of feudalism began to tremble. Out of unimaginable suffering, change slowly began to emerge. But on the ground, in the huts and cottages of ordinary families, the memory of sickness lingered like smoke in the air. To live as a peasant was to live with the shadow of plague always near, a reminder of life's fragility and of the quiet bravery needed simply to endure each day. Now, unfortunately, comes famines and starvation. If plague was a shadow that came suddenly, famine was a slow, gnawing hunger that crept into every corner of peasant life. In the Middle Ages, food was never taken for granted. Each harvest was a gamble, tied to the unpredictable moods of the seasons. A wet summer might rot the crops before they ripened. A dry spring could wither the fields before seed had a chance to grow. And when the harvest failed, so too did the fragile balance of survival. The most infamous of these hunger years was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when heavy rains ruined crops across much of Europe. Imagine endless downpours, the skies dark and grey, fields flooded, and grain sprouting prematurely in the sodden ground. Villages that had worked all spring and summer to secure their food watched helplessly as their stores spoiled before their eyes. Bread, the staple of every peasant's diet, grew scarce. The loaves that were baked were small, hard, and sometimes mixed with ground-up peas, beans, or even weeds, just to stretch the flour. The taste was bitter. but hunger left no room for complaints. Porridge became thinner, often little more than warm water with a hint of grain. Meat, already rare, nearly disappeared from peasant tables. In desperation, some resorted to eating bark stripped from trees, or the roots and leaves of wild plants normally avoided. Famine was not only about food, it was about exhaustion, fear, and the way hunger seeped into the bones. Children grew weak and frail. Mothers tried to hush the cries of their little ones, offering what little scraps they could find. Old men and women wasted away, their strength gone before the spring had returned. Hunger also brought unrest. Villagers whispered about lords who continued to demand taxes and grain, even when the stores were bare. Rumours spread of bakers accused of hoarding flour or millers cheating customers. In some places theft rose sharply, with peasants risking punishment or even death for stealing a loaf of bread or a handful of grain. And yet famine was also met with endurance. Communities banded together, sharing what little they had. Priests organised fasts so that the small stores of food could last longer. Some villagers slaughtered their animals not for daily use, but in careful timing to stretch meat into the coldest weeks of winter. Even in hunger there was rhythm and strategy. The effects of famine rippled far beyond empty stomachs. Malnutrition weakened the body, making people more vulnerable to disease. When plague and famine struck together, the results were devastating. But famine also carried lessons. Those who survived learned which crops endured best, which fields drained well, and which plants could be foraged in the forests when the grain failed. In the quiet endurance of peasants who lived through these lean years, there was a resilience that carried on for generations. They knew that hunger was not an enemy to be conquered, but a storm to be weathered, with patience, with sharing, and with the hope that spring would return with kinder skies. Now let's dive into the relationship with the lords. To understand the life of a medieval peasant, one must understand the web of obligations that bound them to their lords. Medieval society was built on a system we call feudalism, a structure of mutual duties and privileges that tied everyone from kings to peasants into a rigid hierarchy. For the peasant, however, it often felt less like partnership and more like a heavy burden they could never escape. Imagine a village, small and humble, surrounded by fields that stretch out toward the distant manor. At the heart of this system was the lord of the manor, a nobleman who owned the land on which the peasants toiled. In return for the right to live on that land, peasants owed him both labour and goods. This labour was known as corvée, days of free work that peasants were required to give on the lord's land. A man might spend 3 days each week tending not to his own fields but to those of the manor, ploughing, sowing and harvesting crops that he would never eat. His wife might be called to spin, weave or brew ale for the lord's household. Even children could be summoned, perhaps to herd sheep or carry water. Beyond labour there were taxes and dues. Peasants owed a portion of their grain to the lord's granary. They paid fees to grind their wheat at the lord's mill, to bake their bread in his oven, or to use his wine press. On special occasions, like a daughter's marriage or a son's inheritance, the lord might demand additional payments, known as merce or heriot. Life was a constant stream of obligations, and yet, in return, the lord provided protection. In times of danger, raids, wars, or bandit attacks, peasants looked to the manor's strong walls or to the soldiers the lord commanded for safety. The castle or fortified hall became a symbol of both authority and refuge. Still, this balance was fragile. For the peasant, the lord could seem both protector and oppressor. The weight of taxes could drive a family into hunger, especially during famine years. Stories circulated of lords who were cruel, taking more than their fair share, punishing those who resisted with fines, beatings, or even imprisonment. Others, however, were more just, mindful that the prosperity of their lands depended on the survival of their people. In church sermons, peasants were told this was the natural order, that God himself had placed them in their station, and that obedience to their lord was part of their duty. Still, quiet murmurs of resistance lingered. Now and then peasants rebelled. The most famous of these was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, when thousands rose up against unfair taxes and harsh treatment. For a brief moment, the rigid order seemed as though it might crack. But in most villages resistance was subtle. A bushel of grain hidden from the tax collector, a loaf of bread baked in secret rather than at the lord's oven, a day of labour feigned with slowness. These quiet acts of defiance allowed peasants to endure, even within the confines of a system designed to keep them bound. And so, the relationship between lord and peasant was one of tension and necessity, a bond that ensured survival but at great cost. For the medieval peasant, the lord's presence was always felt, in the fields they worked, in the coins they surrendered, and in the knowledge that their lives were not entirely their own. Now the topic of faith and superstition. For the medieval peasant, faith was not just part of life, it was the very fabric of existence. In a world of uncertainty, where plagues could strike suddenly and harvests could fail without warning, the church offered both comfort and structure. To live as a peasant was to live under the shadow of the cross, guided by bells that marked the hours, and by priests who stood as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Imagine a village morning. The faint light of dawn creeps over the horizon, and the first sound to stir the peasants from their sleep is not the rooster's crow, but the church bell. Its deep toll drifts across the fields, calling people to prayer. The small parish church, often the only stone building in the village, stands at its centre. Its walls are cool, its windows narrow, and its air thick with the scent of burning candles and incense. Here, peasants knelt in prayer, seeking forgiveness, guidance, and above all, protection. Life was harsh, but faith gave it meaning. Every birth, every marriage, every death was marked with ritual. Children were baptized, young couples blessed, and the dead buried with prayers to speed their souls to heaven. The rhythm of the year was measured not just by seasons of planting and harvest, but by the liturgical calendar. Feast days of saints, the fasting of Lent, and the celebrations of Easter and Christmas. But alongside faith lived superstition. For peasants, the world was full of unseen forces. Illness might be seen as punishment for sin, or as the work of dark spirits. A withered crop might be blamed on witches or on the evil eye. Charms and amulets were carried to ward off misfortune. A sprig of rosemary hung above the doorway, or a carved symbol scratched into a beam was believed to protect a home from sickness or evil. The church often frowned upon these folk practices, but it was hard to untangle belief from daily survival. In truth, peasants lived in a world where Christian ritual and folk magic blended seamlessly. A mother might pray to the Virgin Mary for her child's health, and also tie a protective charm of herbs around the baby's neck. A farmer might sprinkle holy water on his fields, and then place a carved stone to guard against blight. faith also offered hope in the face of suffering. When famine struck, peasants turned to processions, carrying relics of saints through their fields, begging for rain or sunshine. When plague swept through villages, prayers and confessions filled the churches. The promise of heaven gave meaning to lives filled with struggle, and the threat of hell reminded peasants to remain obedient to both church and Lord. And yet, faith was not only fear, it was also joy. Feast days brought music, dancing, and shared meals. Bells rang out in celebration, and the churchyard became a place of gathering and laughter. Faith bound communities together, not just in ritual, but in the reassurance that even in hardship, they were part of something greater, something eternal. Close your eyes and hear the tolling of the church bell, slow and steady across the misty fields. Imagine the flicker of candlelight in a dark stone chapel, the murmur of prayers rising with the smoke of incense, and the quiet faith of peasants who endured the weight of the world with hope in their hearts. This was faith and superstition in the life of the medieval peasant. Not two separate worlds, but one woven together in every moment of survival. Oftentimes there was seasonal struggles for peasants. Time itself was measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the changing of the seasons. Each shift in the weather carried its own demands, its own dangers, and its own chances of survival. To live in the medieval countryside was to live in rhythm with the earth, its gifts and its punishments alike. Spring was a season of hope, yet also of hunger. The stores from the previous harvest had often run dangerously low by March and April. This was called the hungry gap, when food supplies thinned and the new crops had not yet ripened. Peasants stretched their meals as far as they could, relying on dried beans, barley bread, and whatever could be foraged in the woods, young nettles, wild garlic, bitter roots. At the same time, spring demanded labour. The fields had to be ploughed, seeds sown, animals tended. Men worked from sunrise to sunset, driving oxen across heavy soil, while women and children followed behind, scattering grain into furrows. Hunger weighed on their bodies, but the work could not wait. Summer brought warmth and longer days, but it also carried risks. Crops needed constant care, and weeds and pests could undo months of labour. Storms could flatten fields, while drought could wither them. Peasants spent hours bent under the sun, weeding, tending, and watching anxiously for signs that their labour might fail. Yet there were moments of relief too. Feast days, midsummer celebrations, and evenings when music drifted across the village green, laughter mixing with the sound of crickets. Autumn was the season of reckoning. The harvest had to be gathered quickly before the weather turned. Whole families worked together, cutting sheaves of wheat and barley, stacking them into bundles and carrying them to barns. Every grain mattered. A good harvest meant survival. A poor one meant hunger. Villagers often gathered for harvest festivals, offering thanks to God for the bounty, sharing bread and ale in celebration, even if the fear of winter lingered quietly in the background. Then came winter, the harshest season of all. The cold crept into huts with little resistance. Fires burned day and night, but fuel was scarce, and many families huddled together under blankets and cloaks for warmth. Food stores dwindled as the weeks dragged on. Salted meat and dried beans grew monotonous, and sometimes the barrels and sacks stood empty before spring returned. The sick and elderly were most vulnerable, their bodies unable to endure the cold and the hunger, and yet there was also resilience. Winter evenings were filled with stories told by the fire, songs passed down through generations, and the weaving of cloth by flickering lamplight. Though the world outside was harsh and barren, the hearth offered a fragile but vital sense of comfort and continuity. Season after season, peasants lived at the mercy of the land. They endured the hungry gap, the back-breaking labour of summer, the tense gamble of autumn harvest, and the long nights of winter. Each year tested them, each year demanded their strength, and yet, through repetition and resilience, they survived, as their ancestors had, and as their children would after them. Close your eyes now. Imagine the smell of freshly tilled earth in spring, the golden glow of ripened grain in autumn, the bitter cold of winter wind against your cheeks, and the crackle of firewood that promised just enough warmth to make it through the night. This was the rhythm of the seasons for the medieval peasant, a cycle of struggle, endurance, and the fragile hope that tomorrow would come. Though life for medieval peasants was marked by toil, hunger, and hardship, it was not without joy. In fact, what made survival possible was not only endurance, but also the moments of light that broke through the darkness. The festivals, marriages, songs, and simple pleasures that gave meaning to their days. One of the most anticipated times in the village calendar was the feast day. The church filled the year with holy days: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the feast days of the saints. On these occasions, the usual rhythm of labour slowed, and peasants gathered for celebration. Imagine the village green alive with sound, the ringing of bells, the laughter of children, the music of fiddles and pipes. Men and women danced in circles, their wooden shoes clattering against the earth, while ale flowed freely and bread was shared in abundance. For one day, the weight of work and worry lifted, and the air was filled with joy. Marriage was another moment of respite. It was not only the joining of two people, but of families and fortunes. Villagers decorated the church with flowers and greenery. The bride wore her best gown, perhaps handed down for generations, while the groom might wear a simple garland of leaves. After the vows, a feast followed, where even the poorest family would try to provide more than usual. Roasted meats if they could, honey cakes, and cups of strong drink. The evening ended with dancing, laughter, and songs that echoed into the night. Harvest time, though grueling, also carried its rewards. When the final sheaves were stacked and the barns full, peasants gathered to celebrate. They lit bonfires, sang songs of thanks, and held games, simple contests of strength, races for the children, and playful wrestling matches among the young men. The relief of having enough food for winter was felt in every song and cheer. Even in daily life there were small comforts: the warmth of a fire on a cold evening, the taste of freshly baked bread from the communal oven, the joy of storytelling, tales of saints, heroes, or local legends passed down by elders as children listened wide-eyed. Music too filled quiet evenings: the gentle strumming of a lute, the rhythm of drums, the rise and fall of voices singing together, and sometimes there was laughter in the most ordinary of moments. Children played with dolls made of rags or carved wooden animals. Boys chased each other through the fields with sticks for swords. Girls sang as they spun wool, turning work into song. Even amid struggle, the spirit of play lived on. These moments of respite were vital. They reminded peasants that life was not only about survival, but also about community, celebration, and joy. They strengthened bonds between families, gave relief from the weight of labour, and offered hope that the world, though harsh, could still be filled with warmth and meaning. Close your eyes now. Hear the echo of church bells on a festival day, the sound of fiddles and laughter in the village square, the crackle of a bonfire under the stars, and the quiet hum of a lullaby sung to a child. This was the light in the life of the medieval peasant, fragile, fleeting, but powerful enough to keep them moving forward through hardship. For the medieval peasant, survival was not just about enduring a single day of labour or even a single season of hardship. It was about finding ways to endure across years, decades, and generations. Their strategies were not written in books or taught in schools, but learned through experience, passed down in stories, and carried quietly in the rhythm of their daily lives. One of the most important strategies was community. No peasant family lived in isolation. Villages were close-knit webs of families, bound together by necessity. When a harvest was poor, neighbours might share what little grain they had. When a house needed repair, villagers came together to rebuild it, thatching roofs with bundles of straw and patching walls with mud. In times of sickness, women gathered at the bedside, bringing herbs, prayers, and companionship. Alone, survival was fragile. Together, survival was possible. Another strategy was resilience through simplicity. Peasant homes were humble, their diets plain, their possessions few. Yet this simplicity made them adaptable. A family accustomed to living on coarse bread and porridge could endure lean years more easily than wealthier households accustomed to luxuries. Clothing was patched and repatched, boots mended again and again. Nothing was wasted. Even broken pottery was reused, and ashes from the hearth found their way into soap or fertilizer. Peasants also relied on knowledge of the land. Generations of experience taught them which fields drained best in wet years, which crops resisted drought, and which wild plants could be eaten when the fields failed. They knew the signs in the sky, the patterns of animal behaviour, and the smell of the earth that warned of changes to come. This deep familiarity with nature was not written in ink, but in memory and instinct. Faith and ritual also played their part. Beyond belief in salvation, faith created a framework for endurance. The calendar of feast days and fasts gave structure to the year. Rituals of blessing fields, homes, and wells provided reassurance, a sense that their struggles were guided by forces greater than themselves. Superstitions, charms, amulets, whispered spells gave peasants a sense of control, however small, in a world that was often unpredictable. Adaptation also came through family bonds. Children were not only beloved but essential, contributing labour from an early age. Large families meant more hands to work the fields, more eyes to watch the flocks, more voices to carry on traditions. Elders, though frail, carried wisdom, knowledge of past famines, remedies, and stories that held lessons for survival. Even in their hardships, peasants understood the importance of balance. They saved seed for planting, resisting the temptation to eat it in hunger. They stored surplus when the harvest was good, aware that another bad year might be around the corner. They planned not just for today, but for tomorrow, and for the years beyond. And when the weight of life grew too heavy, peasants turned to their moments of joy. Festivals, songs, laughter, and stories, not as luxuries, but as strategies of survival. For without hope, even the strongest body falters. Close your eyes now. Picture a village gathered in a circle, neighbours mending a roof together, children laughing despite empty stomachs, elders telling tales by the fire, their voices weaving lessons of endurance into the night. This was how medieval peasants survived, not only day by day, but across centuries, through community, knowledge, faith, and resilience. The story of medieval peasants is not one of ease or luxury, but one of endurance. They lived beneath the weight of plagues, endured the ache of famine, and worked tirelessly under the demands of their lords. Yet, through all this, they found ways to survive, in their bonds with one another, in their faith, in their resilience, and in the small joys that gave light to their days. Picture, one last time, the village at dusk. The sun sinks low, and a soft glow spreads across the fields. Smoke drifts gently from the thatched roofs, curling into the evening air. Families gather by the hearth, children dozing as elders tell stories of saints, of harvests, of survival. The sound of crackling fire fills the hut, mingling with the quiet rhythm of voices. Outside, the fields rest beneath the stars, waiting for tomorrow's labour. Life was never easy for the peasant, but in their endurance we see a quiet strength. The strength of ordinary people who carried on, season after season, year after year, shaping the very foundation of history. And now, as their story fades into silence, let it carry you too into rest. Breathe slowly, deeply, and let the weight of the day slip away. Imagine the gentle toll of a distant church bell, slow and steady, guiding you deeper into calm. The world grows quiet, the fire burns low, the village sleeps, and so can you. This has been the story of how medieval peasants survived plagues, famine, and lords. May their endurance lull you into peace, and may your dreams be filled with stillness, warmth, and rest.